We will not beg. We will not bow to hunger or dependency. We will revive our rivers, fill our nets with life, and we will feed our children with the strength of our own hands.
It was not oil, not gold, not even diamonds that Ibrahim Traoré poured into the lifeblood of Burkina Faso. It was fish. 150 tons of live tilapia, carp, and catfish, released in a single day. The rivers, once quiet and skeletal, suddenly glittered with silver rain. Soldiers stood guard on wooden boats. Villagers cheered along the banks. Cameras captured the sight of life cascading into waters long abandoned. To outsiders, it looked reckless. A poor, landlocked nation spending scarce funds on fish? Why not build roads, hospitals, or power plants instead? But to those who understood Traoré's vision, the answer was obvious. Because food is power, and survival is sovereignty. The weight of hunger. For decades, Burkina Faso's markets overflowed with frozen imports trucked in from distant coasts. Plastic-wrapped fillets from Abidjan and Tima filled stalls while local rivers grew empty. Fishermen abandoned their trade, families went hungry, and wildlife that once thrived on natural stocks vanished. Most leaders shrugged. Dependency, they said, was inevitable. Geography had cursed the nation. But Traoré refused that logic. By restocking rivers with fast-breeding fish, he was not only feeding villages. He was declaring independence from dependency itself. Each fish was more than a creature. It was a statement. Burkina Faso would not beg for protein from foreign ports. The gamble. Was it wasteful spectacle or a masterstroke of imagination? Critics scoffed, calling it madness. Supporters called it rebirth. Yet no one could deny its symbolism. The choice of species was deliberate. Tilapia, resilient and fast-growing. Carp and catfish, hardy enough to thrive in varied waters. Within months, nets grew heavy again. Fishermen returned. Women who once carried overpriced frozen imports now carried baskets of fresh tilapia. Families who had not tasted fish in years saw it steaming on their plates once more. But beneath this ecological revival lay something deeper. Traoré knew that hunger was not just a social issue, it was a weapon. A hungry people can be manipulated by insurgents, foreign powers, or corrupt elites. A fed people are harder to break. Every fish pulled from the river became more than protein. It became a stabilizer, a shield, a quiet vote of confidence. From rivers to revival. The initiative didn't end with one release. Training programs in aquaculture spread through villages. Nets and cages turned rivers into living farms. Hatcheries rose along the banks, ensuring fry to replenish stocks for generations. The rivers became natural factories, producing food, jobs, and pride that no foreign donor could monopolize. Images of villagers cheering as waves of fish splashed into the rivers spread across Africa and beyond. In Bamako, Niamey, Dakar, young Africans shared the story online. Here was a leader not cutting ribbons at aid projects, but breathing life back into his rivers. The critics versus the people. Foreign economists dismissed the initiative as little more than a short-lived stunt, warning that polluted waters and fragile ecosystems would doom it. Western headlines labeled it reckless, even comical, an act of naive populism. Opposition politicians at home sneered, calling it a waste of scarce funds. Yet in the villages, the truth unfolded with undeniable clarity. Fishermen returned to rivers they had nearly abandoned, pulling in nets that grew heavy once more. Women smoked, salted, and sold fresh fish in markets at prices families could finally afford. Children who had grown up on bland meals of sorghum now tasted protein again, their bodies stronger, their energy renewed. Even wildlife returned, birds wheeling above riverbanks, crocodiles basking where waters had long gone still. What critics mocked as theater, citizens experienced as life flowing back into their daily existence. To the people, it was not spectacle. It was survival, dignity, and hope reborn. Fish diplomacy. The ripple spread beyond borders. Delegations arrived quietly to study what became known as fish diplomacy. Youth movements in Mali and Niger praised it as proof Africa could innovate instead of begging. Regional leaders debated whether their rivers, too, could be reborn. And in Washington and Brussels, unease grew. For decades, Foreign powers had maintained leverage through food aid and exports. What happens if African nations no longer need them? What if sovereignty could be built not on loans, but on rivers? This was not just about fish. It was about the global order. Food as politics. Traoré's message cut sharp, like a blade through silence. A hospital treats sickness. Food prevents it. A road may carry goods, but it cannot feed a child. Solve hunger, and you solve unrest. Solve unrest, and you consolidate sovereignty. For the first time in decades, Burkinabe citizens felt a direct and undeniable link between state policy and their own survival. No campaign speech, no rally, no empty promise could match the impact of fish on their plates. Nutrition was no longer an abstract statistic. It was visible in the strength of children, the confidence of fishermen, and the bustling energy of markets once fading. Loyalty, once corroded by years of broken trust, began to grow back with each fresh catch. Even the fiercest critics in Parliament found themselves cornered, unable to dismiss the evidence that ordinary families carried home in baskets and pots. Simple, shimmering fish had done what politics alone never could. They had shifted the very tide of public opinion. Grassroots transformation. The release of fish was no longer just a presidential gamble. It had become a national movement, one that reached from the cities to the remotest villages, from riverbanks to schoolyards. What began as the bold gesture of one man now pulsed as collective action, embraced by millions who had once felt powerless. Young men who had left for cities in search of uncertain jobs began to return home, drawn back to rivers that no longer lay silent. Fishing was no longer a dying trade but a revived livelihood. Canoes once abandoned were patched and repainted, nets repaired and stretched wide. The sight of fish glimmering beneath the surface was not just a promise of income but a reminder that leaving was no longer the only option. Women, too, seized the moment. Across villages, they formed cooperatives to process, smoke, salt, and sell fish. What had once been an expensive import wrapped in plastic was now a thriving local product, traded in baskets, carried to markets, and sold with pride. These cooperatives became more than businesses. They were spaces of solidarity, where women pooled resources, shared profits, and supported one another in building independence for their families. Schools felt the transformation as well. For years, children in river provinces had attended classes on empty stomachs, their focus drifting, their energy fading. Now, dried and smoked fish from the rivers found its way into school nutrition programs. Teachers reported children who were sharper, livelier, and more attentive. A gamble in the waters was quietly reshaping the minds of the next generation, fueling not only bodies but the potential of a nation's future leaders. Even the elders and traditional chiefs, once skeptical, stepped into the movement. They declared sanctuaries along certain stretches of river where fishing would be banned until stocks matured. Rituals were revived, marking these areas as sacred and protected. Youth brigades patrolled the banks, ensuring that rules were honored, blending modern policy with ancestral wisdom. It was a rare harmony, state authority and community traditions working hand in hand to preserve a shared resource. What began as a spectacle, a single day when tanks spilled shimmering waves into rivers, had evolved into something far greater. It became grassroots entrepreneurship, where families built livelihoods from what their own waters provided. It became education reform, where protein on a plate turned into focus in a classroom. It became cultural revival, where rivers once written off as barren flowed again with meaning and pride. The transformation was not top-down. It was bottom-up, carried by fishermen, mothers, elders, and children who saw in each fish more than food. They saw possibility. They saw sovereignty. They saw that independence was not an abstract dream but a living reality that could be caught, smoked, sold, eaten, and celebrated. The rivers had become mirrors, reflecting back a simple truth, that true power is not found in speeches, or loans, or imported aid, but in the ability of a people to feed themselves, together. The risks. Yet risks loomed, pressing against the fragile gains like shadows over the water. Illegal fishing threatened to strip the rivers before the stocks could mature. Pollution from gold mines bled mercury into streams, poisoning both fish and people. Corruption in local markets tempted officials to seize profits meant for communities. International cartels, fearing the collapse of their frozen import empires, quietly sought to sabotage the experiment. But the people refused to stand idle. Youth brigades organized river patrols, confronting poachers before they could strike. Villages rebuilt hatcheries destroyed by floods or neglect, refusing to let momentum die. Traditional leaders declared sacred stretches of river off-limits, ensuring regeneration. What had begun as a presidential gamble was no longer fragile policy. It had become a citizen-led defense of sovereignty. The rivers were no longer just water. They were memory, dignity, and the living heartbeat of a nation refusing to be broken. A continent watching. For Africa, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. If fish could change the destiny of a landlocked nation, what about coffee in Ethiopia? Cocoa in Ghana? Cotton in Mali? Gold in Congo? If one nation could reclaim sovereignty through food, what else could the continent reclaim with equal courage? The reckoning. They mocked fish, but fish fed a nation. They mocked a gamble, but a gamble forged sovereignty. The rivers of Burkina Faso, once overlooked and dismissed as barren, became more than waterways. They became living proof that independence is not secured only by flags raised high or guns carried on the battlefield. True independence, Traoré showed, begins with dignity. The dignity of a parent who can feed a child, of a fisherman who can cast his net with hope, of a people who no longer bow to dependency. And so the question remains, for you and for the world. Was this only a curious experiment, destined to be remembered as a fleeting spectacle? Or was it the first spark of a movement capable of reshaping Africa's future? Because in the end, the true power of the fish was never just in the rivers. It was in the villages where families shared meals once again. It was in the markets where women's baskets brimmed with fresh tilapia. It was in the pride of citizens who had long been told they could not provide for themselves, only to discover they could. Sovereignty, it turned out, could begin with something as simple and as profound as food. The rivers carried more than fish. They carried the weight of hope, the current of resilience, and the possibility that a nation, mocked for daring, had instead written a new chapter of defiance.